the month of Ellul. So there is a piyut, a Jewish liturgical poem that appears in the Rosh Hashanah davening and in the Yom Kippur davening, B'chol Ma'aminim. I think it's a beautiful piyut. There's a question to ask though. The Hebrew word, so B'chol Ma'aminim, what does it mean? So it depends on which machzor you look at, but it's generally translated as and everyone believes. And then we go through a long list in the piyut of things that everyone believes. But in actual fact, the Hebrew word ma'amin, or from emunah, la'amin, is ambiguous. It's ambiguous between two verbs in English that the English language distinguishes between easily, and the Hebrew language struggles to distinguish between. And that is faith and belief. So in Hebrew, if you were trying to mark the distinction, you could say, do you believe that it's true, or do you have faith that it's true? You can sense, a native English speaker, I think, can sense quite different collections of nuances that come along with belief, that come along with faith. If you asked a Hebrew speaker to mark that distinction in Hebrew, it's actually not all that easy. In philosophy departments where we teach epistemology, the study of belief, we distinguish between emunah and amanah to make this distinction between belief and faith, but it's quite artificial. That's only something we do in our philosophy departments. On the street in Israel, the word amanah would sound quite artificial and peculiar. And in fact, there's a disagreement, as far as I'm aware, between the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and the University of Haifa, because in the University of Haifa, we use the word emunah to refer to faith and amanah to refer to belief. And I think in the university in Jerusalem, they do it the other way around. So it's a complete mess. When the Torah uses the word, or this shoresh, it's the same shoresh, by the way, as the word amen, right? That we say, aleph mem nun. When the Hebrew Bible uses this root, does it mean belief or does it mean faith? A key appearance of the word is in Sefer Bereshit, the book of Genesis, chapter 15, verse 6, where it says that, and this is after God has made various promises to Avram about his children and whatnot. It says that Avram had faith in God and he considered it unto him as righteousness. So the way this is normally understood, so the Hebrew there is V'hemin b'Hashem v'yachshavei lo tzedakah. The way this verse is often understood is like with Rashi. The idea is that Avram had faith in God, and then Rashi says, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be He, Hashva l'Avram l'zachot l'zchut l'tzedakah al ha'emunah shehamin bo. God considered Abraham righteous for having faith in him. So again, just take a look at the verse. Abraham had faith in God and he considered it unto him as righteous. Abraham had faith in God, and God considered Abraham to be righteous because of the faith that Abraham had in God. Okay. The Mechilta says, V'chein ata motzeh shelo yarash Abraham avinu ha'olam hazeh v'olam haba ela b'zchut emunah she'emin b'Hashem. Right? Shene'emar v'emin b'Hashem v'yachshaveh lo tzedakah. Do you want to know? Says the Mechilta. It's an early halachic midrash. You want to know why Abraham inherited so much, both in this world and in the world to come? And the Mechilta says, I'll tell you why. Because he had faith in God. And because he had faith in God, and God considered this to be some sort of great deed of Abraham's, that he was entitled to inherit all that he did in this world and the world to come. So that's one way of looking at the verse. And I would want to argue that there, both Rashi and the Mechilta are probably understanding the word emunah as faith. And I think you'll see why when you compare it and contrast it to the commentary of Nachmanides. What does Nachmanides say? It says, Ve'eni mevin ma haschut hazah. I don't understand what this great merit is. Lama lo yamin be'Elohei aman. Why wouldn't you have trust in a trustworthy God, right? Why wouldn't you have faith in a faithworthy God? V'hu hanavi ba'atzmo, v'lo ish el v'yachazev, which he's not a deceitful person. He is a prophet, and God isn't a deceitful person. V'lo ish el v'yachazev. U'mi she'amin lishchot et bano hayachid ha'ahuv. Somebody who had so much faith that he was willing to slaughter his only beloved son in the trial of the Akedah, and all the other trials that Abraham was tested in and succeeded. How could he not believe when God says, I'm going to do something good for you? How could Abraham not believe? Obviously going to believe. The reason I want to suggest that Nachmanides is thinking of this as belief is belief is an attitude you have towards a claim as soon as you have enough evidence for it. In fact, you don't actually choose what you believe. You believe what you have evidence for. And therefore, what you believe or what you don't believe, it's not a credit to you, unless, you're to be praised perhaps for really looking into the evidence or acquiring the right sort of evidence. But once you've got the right sort of evidence to believe in a claim, you don't choose to believe in what you believe, you just believe in it. And a prophet like Abraham has a tremendous stream of evidence that God exists and that God is good, and because he has a direct personal connection with God that is incomparable to the connection that a non-prophet has with God. So Nachmanides says, I just don't get what the big merit is over here. And actually what Nachmanides does is he completely rereads the verse. He says, Abraham had faith in God, and Abraham considered God to be righteous. That's how Nachmanides reads this verse, completely differently. There's no righteousness manifest in Abraham having faith, because I think Nachmanides is relating to this, what I just called faith, as actually belief rather than faith, not something that you choose to do, not something that's meritorious. And if anyone in this verse is considering someone to be righteous, it's Abraham considering God to be righteous. The way Nachmanides would read this verse is as follows. Abraham trusted God's promises because Abraham believed in God and knew him to be a righteous God. And there's no merit implicit in that. In fact, a student of I don't know how many generations it was exactly, but not very far down from Nachmanides, is Chasdai Crescus. Chasdai Crescus goes so far as to claim that there are only 9 commandments in the Aseret Dibrot. The way to translate the phrase Aseret Dibrot, of course, is we call it the 10 commandments, but actually the Hebrew Aseret Dibrot really means something like the 10 statements. And if you want to know an interesting piece of trivia, I think I'm right in saying the following. It's definitely more than 10, but in the Rambam Sefer Mitzvot, I think he counts 14 mitzvot in the 10 statements. So don't call them 10 commandments, call them the 14 commandments that are conveyed in 10 statements, if you must. But Crescus thought, no, there are only 13 commandments of these 10 statements. Why? Because there can't be a commandment to believe in God. Anochi Hashem Elokeichem, the first of the 10 commandments, Maimonides understands it to be commandment to believe in God. Crescus says that can't be commanded. It's not up to you what you believe. As soon as you have enough evidence to believe in a claim, you'll find yourself believing it. As soon as you have enough counter evidence for a claim, you'll find yourself not believing it. There's no merit in this, and you don't have any control over it. I want to suggest the reason why perhaps Rashi and the Mechilta thought, no, there is merit in what Abraham did, is because Rashi and the Mechilta, unlike Nachmanides, are relating to this emunah that Abraham had, not as belief, but as faith. So then the question is, well, what do you mean? What's the difference? Well, that's what I'm going to try and explain. There's a very special verse in Parashat Azinu, which is the final song that Moses gives at the end of the book of Deuteronomy. And there's a very well-known verse in that song. The verse says, Hatsur Tamim or Hatzor Tamim Pa'alo, the rock whose works are perfect. Ki chol drachav mishpat, because all of his ways are just. El Emunah, well, that's generally translated as a faithful God. Ve'ein avel, with no iniquity. Tzadik ve'yashar hu, he is a righteous and upright God. This is amazing midrash. I happen to know it was a midrash of which the late great Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs was tremendously fond of, because he quotes it in a number of different places. The Sifri, which is again a very ancient, what's called the halachic midrashim, which are the earliest collections of midrashim, says Hatzur, which means the rock, kind of play on words. It could come out as the tsayer, which is a sculptor. The sculptor who sculpted the world and sculpted man. Because it says in the book of Genesis, chapter 2, verse 7, that the Lord God vayitzer et Adam. He sculpted or formed man. So this part of the Sifri, it kind of wants to say, when we talk about God, his works are perfect, what works are we talking about? A later part of the Midrash says the works he's talking about are his works of judgment. He's a perfect judge. Because if you look at the rest of the verse seems to be very interested in God's lack of iniquity and his righteousness, his uprightness. But no, the beginning of this Midrash says the works in question are the works of creation. And the hint to that is that we're calling him the Tsur, the rock, which kind of alludes to this verb, vayitzer, one of the creative verbs that's used to describe God's action in the creation. And this particular action is sculpting. So the Midrash carries on. His work, being the work of creation, his work is perfect. Says the Midrash, his work is complete over all that comes into the world. And there's no place to wander after his attributes, saying, I love this part of the Midrash. If only I had 3 eyes. As a parent of relatively young children, sometimes you wish you had one in the back of your head, right? You're not supposed to say that, if only I had 3 eyes, because God created the human form and he did it without any blemish or any problem. If the human form has 2 eyes in the front of the head, that's where they're supposed to be, 2, not 3, right? You're not supposed to say, oh, if only I had 3 hands, if only I had 3 legs, if only I could walk on my head. I really have no idea why the Sifri thought that would be a particularly useful skill to have. But okay, if only I could walk on my head. If only I had a face that could turn all the way round. Well, we've already discussed why that would be nice. How nice it would be. The Torah comes to teach us not to make such complaints because his works are perfect. Tamim pa'alo. This midrash is particularly, I think, daring in a sense, because it tells us what complaints we shouldn't make. It says a 2-legged person shouldn't complain for not having 3. A 2-eyed person shouldn't complain for not having 3 eyes. I find it very interesting that it doesn't say that a disabled person, a person born with only 1 leg, should, that person shouldn't complain, which is kind of interesting. It's to say, perhaps this midrash is allowing a certain room for people who for one reason or other, don't completely live up to the general design plan for their species. Perhaps they are allowed to complain, or if they do complain, it's not as serious. But those of us who are fortunate enough to kind of conform to some degree or other to the design plan of the species, the general design plan of the species, we're not to complain. For all his ways of justice, the Midrash continues, that means he sits with each and every person in judgment and gives to them what is fitting for them. El Emunah. What does that mean? Well, if the works we're talking about are primarily his works of creation, apart from this little deviation, we say, the Chol Drachav Mishpat, all of his paths of justice, that's talking about his judicial role, his role as a judge. But generally, this verse wants to say that this midrash wants to say the verse is about God's creative activities rather than his judicial activities. What does it mean, God of faith? Well, if we were talking about him being a judge, maybe it would mean something like trustworthy, like a faithful God, Ellul, trustworthy God. But like I said, this midrash is trying wherever it can to view this verse as a description of God's creative activity, So what does El Emunah mean? It means a God of faith, that he had faith in the world and created it. The translation in Hebrew is V'ha'emin ba'olam v'nivra. He had faith in the world and created it. God's work of creation was an act of faith. Again, it seems to be more likely that here the right translation is faith rather than belief, because we're talking about something more like an act of faith. We don't talk about acts of belief. We talk about acts of faith. So what does it mean that the creation itself was an act of faith? Perhaps if we can understand what that means, we'll get a better idea of at least in the rabbinic mind, what faith really is. Okay, so the suggestion is we want to make a distinction between faith and belief. The rabbis tell us that God's creation of the world was an act of faith. If we can figure out what that means, maybe we'll get a better grip on what faith is itself. So here's a nice midrash. We say every Friday night as we make kiddush, and we say it miyamid on Friday night. That God made, he finished making the world in 6 days, and the verse ends with Asher bara Hashem la'asot, right? Which he had created to make. The grammar here is peculiar. Asher bara va'asa ein k'tivkan. It doesn't say which God had created and made. Ela asher bara la'asot. Rather, it says God created to make. Says the Midrash Tanchuma. This is a much later midrash, by the way. It was redacted, perhaps early Jewish medieval, because it's quoted extensively by Rashi, but it's not that much older than Rashi as the text as far as we're aware, although it certainly includes older texts within it. So the Midrash wants to know, what does that verse mean? Shebara, all the works of the creation that God had made, la'asot, to make. It's just bad grammar, right? What does it mean? Rabbi Benaiah said, Shekidma haShabbat v'lo nigmara melachta. What it really means is Shabbat came in so quickly that it kind of caught God unawares, and it interrupted his creation process. I love this midrash. It's so audacious, because every Friday, I don't know if you're the same way, there's always that last minute pre-Shabbat rush where you're trying to get everything finished just before Shabbat comes in. You can't turn the lights on anymore, and you can't do the cooking anymore. You can't say, I have to get it all done just in time. And this midrash conjures up a similar image. God was creating all these things. Oh, and then Shabbat came in. Oh no, I'm not going to be able to finish all the things I wanted to do. Quite audacious. If it wasn't in the midrash, I wouldn't say it. Rabbi Benaiah Amar, Rabbi Benaiah says, Elu hamazikin. These are the demons. What? Shebara nafshoteihem. God had created their souls. Im shehu bara gufan kidesh yom Shabbat. Just as he was about to make their bodies, Shabbat came in. So if you want to know why there are all these demons in the world, it's because God didn't have time to finish their bodies. So there are all these kind of disembodied spirits floating around, getting up to mischief. And there, Shabbat came in too soon. God didn't have time to finish their bodies. So he had to leave them, and they were left as spirits without a body. I'm going to read you just one more part. It's a little bit R-rated, but this is a late night. For me, it's a late night. I'm past the watershed in Israel. I mean, you're a little bit before it, but I'll read it anyway. It says, "V'haba al hasheda havyan lei banim shedim." Somebody who really means has sexual relations with a female demon will have demon children. And what the Midrash is relating to is this view that when a man spills his seed, but not perhaps in the act of creation, perhaps, by the way, it even means in the act of creation, because only one of those sperm cells makes a baby. The rest goes to waste. When there is excess seed, and the seed falls upon a female demon, you're going to spawn demon children. What on earth is going on in this midrash? Right. So I have a suggestion, and I want to share it with you. Of course, God doesn't really get caught out through poor time management at the onset of Shabbat. that there may be a puzzle or a problem, a dilemma that faces anybody who's trying to create something. And it faces even God. The dilemma is this: when do you stop? You see, I'm going to just stop sharing for a moment, the screen. You see, Leibniz, Gottfried Leibniz, famous early modern philosopher, he thought that this world, the world in which we live, is the best of all possible worlds. And his reason for thinking that was that if God is perfect, he wouldn't have made a suboptimal world. So this world must be optimal. This world must be the best of all possible worlds. Now, I'm afraid that seems to imply to me that Gottfried Leibniz didn't have very much of an imagination, because I can imagine much better worlds than the world in which we live. In fact, you may think, and I think this is what Rabbi Benaiah thought, and that's why he wrote this midrash, there's no such thing as an optimal world. Any single world you could always make a better one, right? One way I try to explain this in my book, The Principles of Judaism, I think this is owed to a Christian philosopher called Richard Swinburne, and I got it via a friend of mine, Tyrone Goldschmidt. But the thought goes like this: imagine a world, however nice you can make it as nice as you can in your imagination. Wouldn't it be just a little bit nicer if you added one more cute, fluffy bunny? Why? And if you say no, it wouldn't be nicer because there's not enough space left for it. So add a little bit more space. Oh no, there's not enough food. So add a little more food to satiate this little fluffy bunny. But surely it'll be nicer. And if that world is nice, wouldn't it be even nicer if you just added another little cute fluffy bunny with enough space and enough? And there doesn't seem to be any point at which you go, oh no, that's enough of the fluffy bunnies now. Every fluffy bunny is cute and nice. Why wouldn't you add another one? It seems like there's no ceiling to how great a universe can be. But this becomes a problem, because if you're a perfect being, you want to create a perfect universe, but there is no perfect universe. So ultimately, it seems like what you have to do, I mean, there may be a number of different choices available to a perfect being, but perhaps one choice is this: you just have to take the plunge. There's a number of possible worlds, each one better than the next, so you go to the least acceptable of those worlds. And from every world above that kind of basement level, every world above that, it's good enough for God to make. And ultimately, if he's going to create anything, he's just going to have to take the plunge and create one of them. I think about this like if you're a painter and you're painting a beautiful painting, at some point you have to stop. And it's always going to be the case that you could have added one more drop of paint. Of course it could have been. But if you don't stop at some point, the painting's never finished. You haven't made a painting. Likewise, if you're making a sculpture, at some point, you're going to have to just put the chisel down. And if you don't, you haven't actually created anything, right? It's still becoming. The demons that Rabbi Benaiah is talking about here, I mean, it's clear. The rabbis of antiquity believed in demons, right? They believed in, I mean, the Meiri, that's a very important Provençal medieval rabbi, and Maimonides, and the Rashbam, who was a grandchild of Rashi. Those three medieval thinkers tried to argue until they're blue in the face. The rabbis didn't really believe in demons. They only say they did, but they don't really. But it seems to most people, the rabbis of antiquity did believe in demons. Nonetheless, it also seems clear that in this midrash, the demons are also a symbol for something. And what they're a symbol for is the unspent potential that comes with any act of creation. Because if you're going to create something, at some point you have to say stop. You could always create more, but at some point you have to stop. And the things you could have created but didn't, those are the demons. And they will follow you around always. And there will always be a shadow, in the life of a creative person. Oh, I could have put one more splash of paint over there. Oh, I could have had one more little go with the children. Yeah, but it's always that way, even for a perfect being. And actually, I think that the Midrash's move to human reproduction is a genius move. And again, perhaps the rabbis really believe that we sire demon children. But at the symbolic level, it's a genius move. in even a milliliter of human sperm, there are millions of sperm cells. And each one of them, if it reached the egg first, would be sufficient to create, with the help of the egg, a human child, a person. So every single time a human is conceived, millions of potential humans are not conceived. All of the sperm cells that lose the race, right? There's only one winner, unless you have fraternal twins. There's only one winner. These are the demons. But what you see, and this is coming back to the notion that perhaps God's act of creation was an act of faith, there was a sense in which God had to take the plunge. I'm just going to leave it at that kind of metaphorical level, that imagistic level of God himself having to take a plunge on something. Okay, now let me continue. Another midrash. This is a midrash from Bereshit Rabbah. This could also explain why God's act of creation was an act of faith. Okay. Rabbi Yehuda ben Reb Shalom said, the midrash, by the way, I'm joining midway through the flow. The midrash asks, why did God, after cursing Adam, and why did God, after cursing Eve, and why did God, after cursing the snake, curse the land? You look carefully in Parshat Bereshit, he curses Adam, Eve, the snake, and the land. But what did the land do, right? We know what Adam, Eve, and the snake did. What did the land do? That's what the midrash asks. Rabbi Yehuda ben Reb Shalom said it's because the land, disobeyed God. How did that happen? Well, look carefully in the first chapter of Bereshit. The Holy One, blessed be he said, let the earth put forth grass, herb yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit. Right? In Hebrew, it says, it says just v'chulu, ... You're supposed to know what the verse says. But in full, it says fruit trees bearing fruit. What does that mean? Fruit trees bearing fruit. Why not just say trees bearing fruit? Fruit trees bearing fruit. Well, if they're bearing fruit, of course they're fruit trees. Why did God command fruit trees bearing fruit? Says the Midrash. Well, this was God's plan. Just as the fruit is supposed to be edible, so would be the tree. So God commanded grass to come, and herbs and vegetables, and fruit trees bearing fruit, where you could bite into the orange if you like, or you could bite into the trunk and it would taste just as good. That was the plan, okay? She, however, did not act as she was told, because we're told a few verses later, or a verse later, the land produced grass, herb yielding seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit. It doesn't say fruit trees bearing fruit. So if you pay very, very, very close attention to Parshat Bereshit, what you see is there's a slight gap between what God asked for and what God got. God asked for fruit trees bearing fruit, and he got trees bearing fruit. What's the difference? Well, what he asked for were edible trees. And what he got is the regular fruit trees that are familiar to you and me, where the fruit is edible, but the tree isn't. And it's because the land disobeyed God in this way that it was appropriate for God to curse the earth, right? Rabbi Pinchas says, no. She exceeded God's command. She wanted to do the will of her creator accordingly, and trees bearing fruit implies that even the non-fruit bearing trees yielded fruit. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, we can understand why God cursed the world, because the world disobeyed God. According to Rabbi Pinchas, why was the earth cursed? Well, it's like when you're really, really annoyed with someone, you say, cursed be them and cursed be all who support them. You're right, cursed be the breast that suckled such a one as this. So the earth really didn't do anything wrong. It was all Adam and Eve and the snake, but God's anger, so to speak, flew over to the world. Rav Yehuda has the benefit of making God's creation perfect. When God creates, the world does what it's told. Sorry, not Rabbi Yehuda, Rav Pinchas. But the problem with what Rav Pinchas says is it makes God seem unfair. Why would God curse the world if the world didn't actually do anything? It's not actually fair to curse the breast that suckled the baby, right? It's not the mother's fault if the child grows up to be a rotten apple. Excuse the pun in this context. But Rav Yehuda manages to salvage the justice of God. Oh, it was right for God to curse the earth. There was some at least poetic justice in this, because after all, the earth didn't obey God. But Rav Yehuda ends up making God look like a somehow weak creator, because he asked for one thing and he didn't get it. Well, here is my interpretation of this midrash. There is an idea. It goes all the way back to Plato, which is that concrete reality can never live up to the perfection of an idea. So, for instance, if you have, if you study triangles in geometry, what you're really doing is you're studying the idea of a triangle, and they're always perfect triangles. But try and find me a perfect example of a triangle in the world. Draw on a piece of paper. Oh, that's a good triangle. Now look at it with a magnifying glass or with a microscope and see if it's really a perfect triangle, right? There'll be all sorts of bumps and gaps and whatever, because in concrete reality, things are a bit fuzzy, things are a bit messy. It's only the ideas which are perfect. And I think this midrash subscribes to this view. It says there's always going to be a gap between the idea that someone might have, even if that being is God, and the concrete reality. What God has to reconcile himself to, so to speak, if he's going to create a concrete reality, is that it won't always live up exactly to his ideas, because the only things which are perfect are God and God's ideas, right? So if God's going to make anything which isn't just an idea, but is a concrete reality, there will inevitably be imperfections. Now, what Rabbi Yehuda bar Shalom knows is, what did God say in Parashat Bereshit when he saw the trees and the vegetation? Does anyone know? And God saw it and God said, yes, Tina, it was good, right? So Rabbi Yehuda knows that. He knows Parashat Bereshit just as well as we do. I think what Rabbi Yehuda is saying is, God's not really angry with the earth. It's a kind of poetic justice that God curses the earth because the earth disobeyed God. But God knew the earth was going to disobey him, and he was okay with that. He said it was good. Why did he say it was good? Because it was inevitable that a concrete reality wouldn't live up in every respect to the blueprint, to the ideas. That's just the price of making something concrete. And again, this is part of what it means for God to have faith in reality. It's to say the idea was worth it. The idea was so worth it that it was worth trying to make it concrete, even if that meant that there would inevitably be some sort of gap between the perfect idea and the concrete reality made, to approximate the idea. All right. I'm not going to read these two midrashim because I don't know how much time I've got. So we've got the idea that God takes the plunge in creating the world. Okay? We've got the idea that God reconciled himself to a certain amount of disappointment in making the world. He knows that not everything's going to live up to his expectations, and yet he does it anyway. He sees it and he says, okay, that's good too. I knew that was going to happen. And he reconciles himself to disappointment. The midrash in which I've skipped over suggests that God wasn't able to make the world without chesed. And here I just want to pause and reflect upon what it means for a second. Chesed means loving kindness. And in the midrash in which I skipped over quickly, the conflict in the divine mind, according to the rabbis, was a conflict between God's chesed, his loving kindness, and his attribute of strict justice. The idea is his attribute of strict justice looked at the world and said, God, these people that you're creating, they're going to be horrible. Have you not seen who their offspring are going to be in the future? And there's a Stalin and there's a Hitler and there's, it's horrible. And God says, yeah, I know, but look at all the tzaddikim that are going to come as well. There's going to be an Abraham and a Yitzhak and a Sarah Imenu and Esther Amalka. And this debate to put a fine point on it, to paraphrase it somewhat, is framed as being a debate between God's sense of justice, according to which the world really shouldn't be made, because it's not going to live up to that ideal that God had. And there's the idea of chesed, a type of loving kindness. And we see this also in artists in general. An artist will never create anything if their perfectionism always wins the day, right? Because no work of art completely lives up to it. So I supervise PhD students from time to time, and master students, and what I have to convey to them is, your thesis is never going to be finished if what you're looking for is the perfect thesis, right? At some point, you just have to be willing to publish, okay? And in doing that, the artist, the writer, has to conquer their own perfectionism. And that's actually showing a certain amount of chesed, loving kindness, to themselves as well as to their creation, right? Because otherwise you never get any project off the ground. So again, to go back, what we see, God's act of creation is being characterized by the rabbis as involving taking a plunge, as involving reconciling himself to disappointment, and as involving the exercise of chesed. Now, I hope we're ready to come back to this distinction between faith and belief, and figuring out what faith is and how it's different to belief, all on the assumption that God's creation itself is an act of faith. Well, there tend to be three types of faith, according to the philosophers that I've read on this issue. Relational faith is when you have faith in someone, right? I see there's someone called Ian here. Ian, I have faith in you, you might say, right? Or you might say to your spouse, I have faith in you, or we have faith in God. That's a relational type of faith. There's a global faith, which is a phrase that Robert Aldi came up with. He's a philosopher at Notre Dame. And what he means by that is it's a kind of outlook that shapes your entire life. So it's global, right? So you might say the Marxist has a global faith in the coming of the revolution, and that faith organizes all of their activity, all of what they do, right? They live on their commune, and everything they do is organized by this principle. And I would hope that people of great religious faith, their faith also organizes their activity, organizes their behavior, organizes their priorities. But the middle type is propositional faith. This is when you have faith that something is true. I have faith that God exists. I have faith that my wife will be there at the airport to greet me, right? Faith that something is true. This is where faith starts to sound a lot like belief. I believe that God exists. I believe that my wife is going to be there at the airport to greet me, because belief is also propositional. You believe that a proposition is true. You believe that something is true. Now, so what we really need to focus on is this thing called propositional faith. How is it different to belief? Well, my friend, the philosopher Daniel Howard Snyder, says the following things. You really want to understand what propositional faith is, you have to understand the following. It always includes a positive evaluation. As to say, you never have faith that something is true unless you think it's good that it should be true. So, for example, let's imagine, and I don't know the political convictions of those in this Zoom room, and I'm not going to get into political debate this evening anyway. But let's imagine, for the sake of argument, that none of us want Donald Trump to be the president of America again. Let's just imagine, for the sake of argument, that that's what we feel. We don't want him to be president again. Still, you could say, but I believe he will be. Because you can believe that things are true without wanting them to be true. You can believe that things are true without thinking that it's good that they're true. You just believe they're true. But it would be very strange to say, oh, I hate Donald Trump. I hope he's never president of America again, but I have faith that he'll be president again. That's like you've misspoke. You've misunderstood what faith is. But to have faith that something is true is to think that it would be good were it to be true. That's one ingredient of having propositional faith. Another, Daniel Howard Snyder calls it a positive connotative attitude. And all he means by this is that you need to think not just that it's going to be good for the world, but that it will really be good for you too. There are certain things that you could have faith would be, good for the world, but you don't really want them. Not for yourself, not deep down. Says Howard Snyder, faith is personal. So if you have faith that something is true, you've got to think it's not just good for the world, it's going to be good for you too. So you could say like this, imagine you think that Donald Trump's being president would be great for the world, but through no fault of your own, your spouse put £1 million bet on his never being president again or something like that, right? So it would be terrible for you personally if he became president. Even though you think it'd be good for the world, it would be strange to say you have faith he's going to be president if it's not going to be good for you personally too. The other thing he says is he calls it a positive cognitive attitude. It means you have to believe what this means, what this third ingredient means is you have to believe that it's at least possible. If you say, oh, I have faith that Donald Trump is going to be president, but I know he never will be president, that doesn't make any sense at all. But you can say, I have faith he's going to be president, but I'm really not sure that I'm going to be right, right? I have faith, but faith can live in the face of quite severe doubt, right? So imagine you go out campaigning for Donald Trump because you have faith he's going to be a great president, you have faith he's going to be president again, then you're looking at the polling, going, oh, no, he's not doing so well. But it's still possible, right? Polls can be wrong. Polls have been wrong before. So you keep going because you think it might still be possible. But at a certain point, when you become convinced that there's no hope whatsoever that he could ever be president again, then you just be wasting your time going out and knocking on doors or canvassing or polling. So you need to believe at least there's a chance. Okay? T.S. Eliot was a devout Christian. He said, do you believe that Christianity is true? He said, well, I believe it's the least ridiculous of the options open to me. Right? So that's quite a low level of confidence, the least ridiculous of all the options, right? So he's not saying I have a huge amount of evidence. I know that it's true, but just of all the options, they all look pretty odd to me, all look pretty ridiculous to me. Atheism looks ridiculous. This looks ridiculous. That looks ridiculous. This looks like the least ridiculous. That can be enough. That can be enough for faith. It might not be enough for belief. It's certainly enough for faith. And the fourth ingredient is resilience. One of the reasons that faith is resilient, by the way, is it doesn't need as much evidence as belief, right? So once I'm under 50% sure that Trump is going to win the next election, I no longer say I believe, but I could still have faith. And that's why your faith is quite resilient in the face of counter evidence, because faith only dies when the last ember of hope disappears, right? So it's not just when you get the first wave of counter evidence or even the second wave of counter evidence, the faith can keep going until there's no chance at all on your evaluation that this could be true. Then you have to even give up faith, otherwise just being irrational. Okay? But this is what makes faith resilient, is that it requires less evidence and therefore can survive a storm of counter evidence better than belief can. One thing that we see about relational faith, Lara Buchak, a Christian philosopher in Princeton, says, at some point, if you're a rational being, at some point, even for very important questions, you sometimes just have to close the tribunal. What she means is this: I dated my wife. How many dates did I have to go on before I had enough evidence to believe she'd be a good wife? I went on 5 dates. I was pretty convinced by the first, really. And by the 5th, I was definitely convinced. And I was like, why don't you want to marry me already? Have you not seen enough? Right? I've seen enough. Took her a lot longer. Okay, so her tribunal was open for much longer. But at some point, you have to close the tribunal. How are you certain she's not an axe murderer? Maybe she's just very good at hiding the evidence of being an axe murderer, right? Well, so how much evidence do you need that she's not an axe murderer? Well, the thing is, at some point, if you're not willing to close the tribunal, sadly, you'll never get married. And if you believe that marriage is a wonderful institution that can help human flourishing, no doubt it's a risky institution, and people do make mistakes and they enter into marriages that aren't going to be good for them. And we do believe in divorce as the best course of action in the face of some irreconcilable differences. We believe in that. It's actually a mitzvah to divorce in certain circumstances. So dating is a risk. But at the other hand, if at some point you're not willing to close that tribunal, it's like taking the plunge, you're not going to get married at all. And when we talk about global faith, we talk about a choice of priorities. The things that you have a global faith in are the things which kind of structure your entire life. So the things that you take to be most important. So when God created the world, we say he took the plunge. Well, he closed the tribunal, didn't he? He kept saying, well, I could make the world a little bit better with one more fluffy bunny, or a little bit better with two more fluffy bunnies, or a little bit more. But at some point you say, okay, I'm going to just stop now. I'm going to close the tribunal and take the plunge on one. I could have married some other woman, and I may have been happy too. But at some point, I found enough evidence that this girl is a remarkable young woman, and I'm going to have a great life with her. And it matters to me that I should have such a wife. I'm going to close the tribunal. I'm not interested in applications from other candidates anymore. God did a similar thing in creating the world. God also, this notion that he would reconcile himself to disappointment is that God's faith in the world is resilient. He knows that in creating Adam Arishon, he's also going to create evil offspring. He's also going to create the righteous ones, and he believed the righteous ones were worth it. And therefore, his faith in the world is resilient in the face of our sins, in the face of constant disappointment. That's one of the key ingredients we saw of propositional faith. And this idea that God exercised chesed in the creation of the world, it means there was a kind of emotional investment. That's his connotative attitude. God had to want to create. God had to love the idea of creating, because if he didn't, he'd never have overcome his own perfectionism. So I want to suggest that that these midrashim, they really do give us a conception of what faith is and how it's slightly different to believing. Believing is just having enough evidence for something being true. Faith is something different. Faith is having enough evidence to hope, having your desires aligned, being willing to close the tribunal because this thing is important enough to take the plunge on. It's a much richer notion than belief, and it also requires less evidence. Okay, and by the way, that's what I think Rashi was praising Abraham for. Nachmanides is just translating Abraham's emunah as belief, and therefore he sees nothing worth praising Abraham for. But faith is where you manifest your priorities. Faith is where you're willing to take a plunge on something. If that's what Abraham was manifesting towards God, then we can understand why it was praiseworthy. Okay, so what is Rosh Hashanah? Well, because it's the day that the world was conceived. It's crowing God afresh. It's supposed to be crowning God afresh. We crown God again on Rosh Hashanah, right? Unatonid Tokef, the prayer, the central prayer of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is all about re-crowning God as the king of the world. It's also a day that corresponds to the fundamentals of the Jewish faith, because we're saying that we believe in God, that we believe in the creation of the world, that we believe we are God's creations. We crown God. And also, because it's the day the world was conceived, it commemorates God's faith in us. So there's faith going in both directions, the faith that God has in us, the faith that we have in God. Even on Yom Kippur, when we're trying to atone for our sins, we do it in the faith that if we are truly penitent, God will forgive us. So this is why, Tadja, could you run and get me a Yom Kippur Machzor or a Rosh Hashanah Machzor? I'm not talking to Tadja Gaon, the 10th century rabbi. I was talking to my son. Tadja, they're over there on the left-hand side above. Yeah, down. Up. Use your hand to go up. Down. Yeah, over there. That's it. One of those is Yom Kippur. So we have this piyut. I'm finished all the slides, and I just want to round up, and I'll take some questions, and we'll be done. We have this piyut on Yom Kippur and on Rosh Hashanah, v'chol ma'aminim, right? And it always troubled me, and I think the reason it troubled me was because I was translating it as, and everyone believes. And then there was a whole load of stuff we list, which I'm just not sure everyone in my shul believed. Rabbi Wilkinson was saying how I grew up in Leicester. I grew up in Leicester, and I was sometimes shaliach tzibur. I would sometimes lead the community in prayer on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And you know, the Leicester community it's now a very small community. It's a very warm, kind, good, decent, upright community. But I wouldn't necessarily say that it was characterized by tremendous religious devotion. That's not necessarily, you know, the description I'd give of it. And I think that most of, you know, a large number of the people who worship there on Rosh Hashanah, you know, they're 3 or 4 times a year Jews, and some of them, you know, are more, but they drive to shul and hide the car in general. That's what I used to do as a kid too. You know, you drive to shul, and if you drive past the rabbi, you have to duck because you don't want the rabbi to see you. That was the Judaism we practiced in Leicester. And I'm sitting there on the bimmer, leading this song, and I was worried that I was being dishonest, because we don't all believe these things, do we? Right? Do we? And I think that things change remarkably. One second, couldn't find it easily in my machzor, the whole meaning. Yeah, I'll just get the lyrics up through Rabbi Google instead. It's such a beautiful piyut. You can find the whole. I mean, but it's here. Yes, it's here. The whole ma'aminim. Right. So I just want to look very quickly at the words with you. If you like, I'll share the screen again. I'm not going to get my wife is encouraging me to sing it for you, but I'm not going to do that. I won't be. Okay, so it's a piyut by Yanai, who was a famous paitan, a writer of liturgical poetry from the 6th century. It says here, Mea Shesh, right? It says, Ha'oches biad midat mishpat, v'chol ma'aminim shehu el emunah. So the first thing to point out is, it is beautiful. The first thing we say that everyone has faith in is that God is a God of faith, which is an allusion to the verse we saw in Parshat Ha'azinu that says that God has faith. And what does that mean? Says the Sifra, it means that God's creation of the world was an act of faith. This already starts you to push you in the direction of faith, not belief. Because if you know the background of El Emunah and how the rabbis understood what El Emunah is, it's God's faith. We have faith in a God who has faith in us. Right? And then look at the things that we believe that he does. We believe shehu bochen klayot, that he knows deep down. That means he kind of, I don't want to translate it to anatomically, but it's something like, you know, he checks our gut, right? He's looking inside our guts. What it means is he knows what we're really like. And most of us deep down are good people, right? We do lots of terrible things, but we have faith that God knows what we're really like, right? He's a very strong redeemer. We believe that he's a true judge. We believe that he has always existed and that there's no other with him. We believe that he remembers the covenant, so we're not going to be in exile forever. We believe, I'm saying believe, but I think it really means faith. We believe that he's alive and existing, that he's good to everybody. That he formed us in our mother's wombs, that he's omnipotent, kol yachol, there's nothing he can't do. We believe that he's alone. We believe that he's the king of the world. We believe in his chesed, in his loving kindness. We believe in his forgivingness. We believe, you see, we believe that he's not one to punish harshly. We believe that he has an open hand. Isn't it funny? It doesn't say things like we believe that he sends sinners to hell. It doesn't say that here, right? We might believe that, but those aren't things that it's easy to have faith in, because those aren't things that we necessarily want to be true. Basically, all of the things that are on this list are things that most of us would wish to be true, right? So, no, perhaps not everybody in shul believes these things, but do they think it's possible? Yes, I think they all think it's possible. Do they want these things to be true? I think at least perhaps when they're singing it, they do, right? And therefore, you've got the conative aspect that Dan Howard Snyder thinks characterizes faith, the conative aspect being the desire. And you've got the cognitive aspect, which is the belief that it's at least possible. And therefore, perhaps we really can say, V'chol ma'aminin, everybody who's there in shul with us really does have faith. Some of those people have a stronger faith, which goes higher than just propositional faith, to shaping their lives, right? That's global faith. Well, no, not everybody has that yet. But there's some faith that they all have. And the hope is, of course, that we can come into Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and find some way of renewing the faith that we all have. And in the act of renewing it, set it ablaze such that it will start to organize our life. It will start to shape our priorities and be manifest not just as some deep desire in our gut, but as an organizing principle of our lives. And perhaps also, two final ideas I'll leave you with. Perhaps also the recognition that to have rational faith that God exists and it's worth serving him requires less evidence than rational belief. Rationally requires less evidence. So you're not being irrational to have faith in things that you don't necessarily feel you have enough evidence to be certain over. I didn't have that type of evidence when I married my wife, and yet it was a rational thing to do. At sometimes it is rational to take a plunge. That's one thing I think it's useful to think about over Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. It's reasonable for us to take a plunge if the values that we're taking a plunge on are worthy enough to risk shaping your life around them. The second thing I just want to share with you, and it's even quicker, is that perhaps the notion of a God who has faith in us would be a redemptive notion to take with us into the times of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. One of the worst things, one of the worst obstacles in the way to becoming more religious is the idea that you can't do it, right? You're not holy enough, you're not good enough, you don't have the spiritual, physical, or whatever other resources to do it. But if you believe that God has faith in you, then you shouldn't allow yourself to stumble in the quicksand of low self-esteem, which is a terrible obstacle in this time of year. Especially because we're encouraged to look at all of our faults, and we should, and we need to repent for them. But we shouldn't allow that process of looking at all of our faults and repenting for them lead us to think that we are unworthy of redemption, because we have faith in a God of faith. So that's the shiur. I took up a whole hour of your time. I'm willing to stick around for some questions if people want to, but I'll hand back the chair to Rabbi Wilkinson.
Thank you very much, Yeshka. Really appreciate it. Although I did lose little bits in the middle because of my internet connection, for which I apologize. Ian.
It's just a few observations. Mm-hmm. All right. You mentioned before about the fact that you are controlled, the possibility of having 2 eyes and 2 ears, 2 arms, mm-hmm. 2 legs. In fact, I was taught that, in fact, if you question this concept, 2 eyes you are. Now, spell it out again. 2 eyes you are. 2 eyes you are. All right.
2 eyes you are. Very nice. If you were to question these things, right? Yes. Very nice.
Okay.
Lovely observation.
And the other thing was about the Bolshevik Revolution, which you mentioned in passing. Mm-hmm. But if you read Dostoevsky, mm-hmm. Which predated that,
predates it,
of course. Yes, he mentioned it that you are opening up a can of worms, effectively, mm-hmm. which we now see even now. Mm-hmm. But you're opening up a can of worms. So
he was responding to the. Carry on.
We were forewarned about the possibility of this 2-headed monster of revolution.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's an interesting.
Or be Trotskyists.
It's an interesting point. Dostoevsky, of course, was probably responding to the emancipation of the serfs in 1861, and and I think he could see in writing Crime and Punishment and The Idiot and various books that post-date the emancipation of the serfs. He was concerned, I think, about the rate of cultural change and revolution. You're right. How does this relate to what I was talking about? I can try and shine a light.
It's about revolutionary.
That's right. Well, it's actually about the possession of what Robert Aldi calls a global faith, a faith that organizes all of your activity, and all of your behavior. And you see this in both religion and in very ideological politics, right? So when I was a student, I was involved in student politics, and I knew all these Trotskyists, whose they were like religious zealots, because their entire life was lived around this great hope, the hope of the coming revolution. They lived in communes. For some of them, it became almost cult-like. They cut off their relationships with their families and whatever, and they, I had friends or acquaintances, who gave up the chance of a quite profitable living.
My grandfather was a friend of Trotsky.
Really?
He was a from fellow.
Really?
And Trotsky believed that you had to apply through the courts to be able to overthrow anything.
Yes, well, that's right. That's right. Well, this is a big difference between Trotsky and Stalin, was that Trotsky was actually a Democrat at heart. He wanted there to be a democratic socialist revolution. But anyway, the point I was trying to make is that there was, in a sense, something inspiring about these chaps, which is that they had such faith in an ideal that they were willing to organize their entire life around it. The question is, which ideals do you place your faith in? There is a sense in which Judaism believes in a utopic revolution. That utopic revolution is the coming of the Messiah. But there's a big difference. The big difference is that really we, unless you go into the really apocalyptic stuff of Gog and Magog and whatever, the wars at the end of time, what we Jews tend to believe in, the emphasis of rabbinic Judaism is actually, no, it's not revolution, it's evolution. Because what's going to happen is the Jews are going to keep serving God in the only ways they know how, which is keeping the mitzvahs and trying to be a light to the nation. And eventually this will unfold into a utopia through evolution rather than revolution. And I think you're right. Revolution can be, as you said, this two-headed monster. Violent revolution, of course, can bring all sorts of untold and unforeseen consequences. How does this relate to tshuva? I think there's an interesting point to be made, is that sometimes, and I don't know, Rabbi Wilkinson is free to disagree. I mean, he has to be the shepherd of his flock in this community. But sometimes a person can take on too much too quickly, and in their own lives, they model their religious growth upon a revolution rather than an evolution, and they set themselves up for all sorts of failures. And in general, I think evolution towards an ideal is a more healthy model than revolution.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think that's definitely correct. Thank you so much. I don't know if there's a timeline opening in Israel. It's even later. Not that necessarily yet starting Slichus, not being Sephardi, but it is a late evening, and I really want to again thank you precisely. So I said, you are saved that at least for another week, just. But I really want to thank you for accepting you so that she's become your administrator and helpmate in every sense, because she has been the point of contact that I've had in recent months, and I really, if you pass on our good wishes to her, and that although your tribunal decided their case a little bit faster, at least her tribunal came out with the right decision. I wish you Kasiva Chasimatova. Again, thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you again very soon.
I look
Thank you
forward to
again.
that too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Take care.
so much. It's
Thank you.
fascinating. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank
Absolutely
you.
brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank
Annette.
you.
I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you
Good
so
evening.
much.
Thank you.
Have a good evening. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.